Welcome to the Speak Like a Leader podcast with John Bates. Welcome to the show. With me today, I have someone whom I think you're going to really enjoy. And it's someone who really, I think, sees the world through a very similar lens to the one that I see it through. He's gotten his master's and his PhD and studies the brain deeply. And, reading his book, I kind of felt like we were already, brothers from another mother on some level. So I think you're going to really enjoy my guest today. He's someone who was introduced to me by Mike Midgley. Thank you, Mike. And today with me is Dr. Jon Finn. He is a leadership consultant, and he is the best-selling author of The Habit Mechanic, and he's the founder of Tougher Minds, which is an award-winning consultancy where he is the chief habit mechanic. And we're going to find out more about what that means today. Welcome to the show, Dr. Jon Finn.
Hey, John. Thanks for having me. Thanks for that very warm introduction.
Well, I'm super happy to have you. And by the way, you can find John at tougherminds.co.uk. And you can also find him at linkedin.com/in/John-Finn. So John is just Jon, and Finn has two N's, and the DR is doctor. So we'll put all that in the show notes. No need to worry about it. But I'm super happy to have you, John. And I have spent some time with your book and read about your approach and read about your story. And I just think it's super interesting and exciting. And I'm glad that you are, fundamentally, one of the things that I'm really glad you're doing is shouting from the hilltops about the new brain science, right? One of the things you talk about in the book that I think I was a victim of, if you could say it that way, is this whole black box approach that was happening with the brain up until maybe the early 90s, where people were like, oh, you know what? When you're done growing, you can't really learn very well. You're cooked. Who you are is who you are. It's all about your genes. You get what you're given and good luck with it. And that's just not even true at all. In fact, it's kind of like I think it's damagingly false, right?
Yes, the data is very, very clear on a scientific level. But, I think everyone can think in their own lives about things they've learned which they couldn't do when they were a kid. Everyone can use a smartphone now. Smartphones didn't exist until 10, 12 years ago. So we are designed fundamentally as human beings to learn. It's wired into us. We are learning before we're born. We're learning all the way until we die. So really it's a nature plus nurture conversation. And the cognitive skills and how we think, we can learn how to, get better at those in either direction. So we can learn how to get better at worrying and beating ourselves up. And that's easier to do than ever before. Equally, we can learn how to get better at managing how we think. So we worry and beat ourselves up less often. So we are absolutely designed to learn. Fundamentally, humans are designed to move around, solve problems. So to solve problems, we have to learn. We have to grow new connections in our brain via the neuroplasticity process, which we only really started to understand when we got functional MRI scans where we could see inside the brain in real time. Yeah. So yeah, absolutely, we can learn. Well, we're doing it right now.
Right. And so a few things that I caught in the book that I'd love to just hear your thoughts about. I have a list here, but the first one is, this was fairly recent for me, so I feel like maybe I'm behind the curve, but I realized listening to a podcast with one of the leading brain researchers that, it looks like our brains evolved because we move around, right? Like plants don't have brains. They don't move around. And if you're going to move around, you probably need some more processing power because you're going to be moving into different environments. So I had realized, a long time ago that brain and movement were connected. I got that, but it seems like brains evolved because we move, right? I mean, they only really evolved in moving things. So that to me speaks directly to what you're saying, that our superpower is learning. And that superpower doesn't end when we stop, getting taller, right? That we can continue learning, as you said, all the way up until the day we die. And our brain is very plastic for that reason.
Yeah, so human beings, we are, anthropologically speaking, we think that we're designed, we've evolved to move about 12 miles per day.
Mm-hmm.
Which straight away people start to panic because they think that means they have to walk 12 miles a day.
Right.
Doesn't mean you have to walk 12 miles a day. It means that's what you were designed to do. And even if you go back to London about 100 years ago, people on average walked about 10 miles a day.
Yeah.
Now we've shifted into these very, very sedentary jobs where we sit down all day. The pandemic exacerbated that, where some people weren't even leaving their house for a week.
Yeah. Yeah.
So movement and feeling well and getting our brain to function well, which is the foundation of thinking well and feeling well and being our best, are interconnected. So when we move, we release a protein called BDNF, which essentially is like fertilizer for your brain. So it allows you to move, to grow new connections faster. So it's easier for us to learn and solve problems when we've got BDNF in our brain, and we get that when we move around.
Wow. Okay, that is a really great thing to know. I did not know that. And as a side note, just an interesting side note, I read somewhere that most people, back before cars and everything, most people really never got much more than about 15 miles from where they lived, which seems to correlate with what you said. And the other thing that was really interesting is I was a very early stage employee at this company in the United States called Gold Star, and Gold Star sells tickets to live events, for a really good price, and trying to get people to go to live events the same way they go to movies. And what we realized is that when we would put out different events that were available, the buying ratio would just fall right off a cliff at about 15 miles away. Even though people had cars, they still would not buy events like it just went off a cliff if it was 15 miles or more away, which I just think is so interesting, I think it speaks to how deeply a lot of this stuff is programmed.
Sure, yeah. Well, this is what we're getting to, isn't it? That most of what we're doing we're not thinking, oh, that's 15 miles away, I'm not going to go to that. We're just running on autopilot, mindless behavior, predictive brains, and our understanding of that. We might say, well, we understand. Well, we know that most of what we think and do is automated.
Yeah.
That doesn't mirror in our systems, whether it's education, whether it's work culture, whether it's the health authorities trying to get you to change your behavior to do something more positive for yourself.
Yeah.
So I think that pop psychology has done a really bad job on habits. Partly because it's using outdated black box models.
Yeah.
But partly because a lot of what I call habit research isn't labelled as habit research. So Daniel Kahneman, who you'll know through books like Thinking Fast and Slow, won a Nobel Prize for his work in this space, doesn't call doesn't call his work habits, but he's really talking about habits. He talks about heuristics, thinking heuristics. They're thinking habits.
Yeah.
So we are just running on autopilot most of the time, and that's why it's easy to buy into the idea that, well, I'm just not good at this stuff and I'll never be any good at it, because it's hard to see ourselves. It's hard to see ourselves thinking and learning and developing, because most of what our brain is wired to do isn't think about ourselves. It's just to focus on seeing and doing, and just dealing with the things that are going on around us every day, and not thinking so much about ourselves, if that makes any sense.
It totally makes sense. And I had a guest on the show, someone who is actually a dear friend of mine. Her name's Fiona Murden, and she's big in the UK. She wrote a book called Mirror Thinking, and she, she's written a couple of books. She's brilliant. And one of the things that we talked about was the fact that, depending on whose research you're looking at, it seems like 90% plus of what we do is unconscious. Like, we have a very small window of consciousness, and it's exceedingly important that we use that teeny bit of consciousness to feed the right things in to the subconscious, because it's the one that's doing the heavy lifting most of the time.
Yeah, and it's a limited resource, so we call that willpower.
Mm-hmm.
It's the conduit, which is the tiny bit of consciousness you've got in your prefrontal cortex, and it's the conduit for self-awareness, for starting to make change, but it's a limited resource. So we've got to be able to hack into behavioral science to make it easier for us to build the changes, the new habits, the new behaviors that we want to build. And that's why it's difficult, because we might know what we want to do, but doing it is a different story, because to get good at doing it, you've got to practice it.
Yeah.
So the example I always give is that most people know that, and agree actually, it's a good idea to eat 5 portions of fruit and veg a day and to walk 10,000 steps. But yet in the UK, the NHS, the National Health Service, still spends more than half of its annual budget. And the NHS is the biggest company in Europe. It spends most of its budget on diseases that emerge because people don't eat 5 portions of fruit and vegetables a day, and they don't walk 10,000 steps.
Yeah.
So this is why I'm saying that we might say, oh, we know that most of what people do is a habit. Well, that isn't mirrored in how the NHS gets people to change behaviour.
Yeah.
Because they're still at the knowledge level.
Yeah.
So when we understand it's about habits, then we can actually make change happen. This is a lot of the work I do at C-suite level, where I find the biggest frustration that senior leaders have in businesses is they know what they want their people to do, but they can't get them to do it.
Yeah.
So this problem just keeps coming back to them. And when we look at the classic strategic models, they're all based on logic. They're based on knowing. If we know we want our people to do this, and we put this in place, put this in place, put this in place, then this should be the outcome we get. But actually, that old way of thinking completely ignores the fact that people are running on habits.
Yeah.
So actually, you have to move away from what we call knowing-based strategies or logical-based strategies to habit-based strategies. We have to think, well, how do we actually get people to build better habits, the habits that are going to deliver the outcomes for them? And I think that's the cutting edge of high performance, successful change management at an individual level, at an organizational level, in the VUCA world, or whatever we currently call the world where the only constant is change.
Yeah.
So getting good at building new sustainable habits is more important than ever before, because our world is just constantly changing around us.
Well, you remind me of one of my favorite sayings, which is, don't look for bad people, look for bad systems. And you've said this a number of times, and I think it's really brilliant. What we know about how people learn is not mirrored in our systems, So it's not that people are bad. It's not that your team there is that top executive who keeps getting that same problem back. They're not bad people necessarily. It is the system that's not working. And it reminds me of probably my most famous quote of mine, which is, communicating with human beings is not logical. You may have noticed it's not logical, it's biological. And when you understand the biology, you can make it logical again. But anybody who goes in thinking that logic by itself should win, well, maybe it should, but that doesn't matter at all in a world where should doesn't matter. Like logic does not save the day here.
Yeah, I was just written a new article for Forbes, and it's the first time I've used this very specific language, but I'll give it to you first. It's not your people, it's their habits. It's forget human capital, it's habit capital. And when we start thinking about our cultures through that lens, we're going to get much more success, and recognize that leadership is not an art, it's a science, and building new habits is a science. We start to think about it scientifically, what a brain's designed to do, what helps people to establish new behaviors, then we're going to get much more success in building workplaces, schools, whatever we're trying to do, that actually make it easier for people to do the things that are going to be most helpful for them. So I think a lot of the way we're trying to help ourselves and our people do better, it's just outdated thinking. It's not our fault, because it's what we've been taught. And the science is very complicated. You see, this book took me over 20 years to write. I've got 3 degrees in psychology. I've been working in this area for over 20 years. I've spent at least 25,000 hours, creating programs in this area. It's complicated.
Yeah.
And, I've sat in training rooms with neuroscientists on week-long courses, and a lot of those neuroscientists do not have any sense of how the brain works as a functional thing. They're not interested in that. They're just interested in a tiny bit of the brain and what that does. So we've got all this fantastic science going on over there, but it's not very practical. So it takes an awful long time to dive into that area, into that work, and to unpack it and to work out, well, how do we make sense of this so we can actually put it into people's hands so that they can use it to help themselves individually and collectively do better. And that's what the habit mechanic approach is all about. It's all tried and tested. The book is a manual for life. It's not designed to be read once. It's literally something you can keep going back to as an individual, so you can become a habit mechanic, but also as a leader, so you can become a chief habit mechanic, so you can make it super easy for people to, you can build cultures that make it super easy for people to build and sustain new helpful habits. So yeah, it's complex, but hopefully the habit mechanic makes it really simple.
Well, one of the things, so I have 2 things. I want to ask you about your down moment, because this all arose out of a problem that you had. And I think that is always really interesting to hear. And before we go to that, I do want to acknowledge, one of the cool tools that you have in here is, I think, the 3+1 at the end of the day. And I just wanted to say, it's a very similar tool to what the Blue Angels, who are the high performance flying team from the United States Navy, they use that tool, a very similar version of that tool, in their debriefs. And what the 3+1 is, if I get it right, is at the end of the day, sit down and look at 3 things that went well, that you did well today, right? And then look at 1 thing that you didn't do well. And just doing that and kind of debriefing every day with that model is a great way to get present to what's going on. And what the Blue Angels do that's similar is, after every one of their flights, they debrief. And what they do is I think it's really cool. They go around the table and everybody calls themselves out for anything that they did wrong. Like, I had a safety violation if something had gone wrong, it would have been a bad day, and you can count on me to put that on my checklist. I will solve that problem, and I'm glad to be here. And they always end with glad to be here because they are, right? Because like they're doing something really dangerous. Then they go around the table and if you didn't call yourself out for something that somebody else noticed you did, they will now call you out. And you don't want to be that guy, right? So everybody basically calls themselves out, and then they go around a second time, and if there's anything still left, they get it handled. And that takes about 20% of the time that they have, right? And the rest of the time, they watch the videos of the show, and they hoot and they holler and they encourage themselves and they cheer and they jump around and get really happy about what worked, which is basically the ratio that you're recommending, 3-to-1, so that's, it's one of those things that's being used out there by high performance teams that we as individuals can take advantage of, right? And I think the really important thing, I'd love to know your thoughts on this, is that ratio skews much more towards the positive, right? We want 3 things that you did well today or that went well that you want to acknowledge, and then 1 thing that wasn't so good. And I think that ratio is really important.
Yeah, so this is drawn from Barbara Fredrickson's work, who's a very high-profile positive psychologist.
Mm-hmm.
They actually got it down to that ratio. They were looking at, they call it flourishing and languishing.
Yes.
How well were people doing? And so this is one of the so some people will tell you, and I speak to these people quite often actually, who say, well, neuroscience is okay, but it's not really taught us anything new, has it? To which I fall off my chair every time. Because it's taught us, a lot of it is confirmatory data, which is great because that allows us to have more confidence in what we think we understand about humans. So
yep.
We already thought we understood this, and what the neuroscience is doing, it's confirming that. It's telling us the same story, which is great. But it's throwing a few curveballs at us. One is our brain is changing all the time. As you alluded to previously, we didn't used to understand that. The top neuroscientists in the world didn't really think once you stopped physically growing that your brain changed much after that point. That's nonsense. It's changing all the time. And another thing that is thrown at us is the power of negative emotions. We are wired to pay attention to threats. And that makes a lot of sense because our brain's designed for survival, first and foremost, to move around, solve problems. First of all, problems relating to threat, because we're designed to survive. And you can see that in the functional MRI scans, when there is a negative, just how magnetic it is to the brain and how it takes over every function. And if you think of sort of classic management speak, they talk about the sandwich technique. Give them a positive, give them a negative, give them a positive. So that shows you that we didn't understand it. We thought it was a 2-to-1 ratio. It's not. And 3-to-1's a minimal ratio. Sometimes a negative is so heavy that we need 11 positives to balance it out. And I think the point we're trying to get to here is the way I think of the 3-to-1 is that gives us a helpful thinking process. So I don't like positive and negative thinking because I think that it's oversimplistic. If I really like donuts, it's going to be really positive for me to eat loads of donuts for my breakfast this morning, but that might be really unhelpful behaviour for me because I'm trying to lose weight. If I get some negative feedback from my boss, which doesn't feel very good in the moment, but that's essential for me to learn, like in your example of the Blue Angels, that's actually really helpful for me. So what we're trying to get to is not just positive and negative, but we're trying to get to helpful experiences. So your example of the Blue Angels is that they're structuring their meetings so that they're helpful and they actually allow them to move forwards and to get better. And also they're creating a meritocracy by structuring it like that as well, which we know is essential for high-performing teams.
Yeah.
So you're only going to be in the team if you keep learning and improving. So yeah, that's and the 3-to-1 is, as we said, it's a minimal ratio.
Yeah.
But it's the science that sits behind that's really important. Is that the threat? So Fredrickson calls it grounded positivity. So we need the positives to get our brain working well, but think of the negative as the goal. It keeps you grounded, so it keeps you having something to strive towards.
Yeah.
Because these guys you're talking about, they can't just stay static. They have to keep getting better and better and better.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that it's a little simplistic, but the other thing that and the other thing that I hear in that is, I do tend, and maybe you can put some neuroscience on this, but I do tend to believe that we get more of what we focus on and think about most of the time, So if we are keeping that ratio towards the positive and celebrating what worked, we're going to keep more of what worked. And then we can bring in these things that don't work and deal with them more powerfully versus having them just hijack our whole system and become the thing that we focus on. And I know that in my own personal life experience, I had that moment where I realized that what I was thinking about most of the time was what I didn't want. Like, oh, I don't just want a 9-to-5 job. I don't just want to be a cog in the wheel. I don't want to marry somebody who's going to just forget about me the minute we have kids. I don't want to. And I was just like, wow, what am I doing? Like, I'm constantly thinking about what I don't want. And I implemented a little habit to notice that and break myself out of it. And then I would push myself to think about what I do want, right? I want a fulfilling life and I want to be with someone who really loves me and that I have a lot of fun with. And I want to make a difference and I started catching myself and flipping myself into thinking about what I did want. And I can mark that moment in my life and the changes that I believe caused in my life and how much better my life got because of that. And it's very clear for me that was a big thing for me.
Yeah, so you're practicing using different brain circuits, and every time you practice using a brain circuit, it strengthens, it gets stronger. Our tendency, you said, what was I doing? Well, in my head, I was saying you were being a human being, because that's that's what we're designed to do.
Yes.
There's one of the core fundamental parts of my PhD work is a theory called meaning-focused coping, by Susan, who was innovated by Susan Folkman, who's a big professor in stress. And when we look at populations, the reason she innovated that in the stress models was because the previous stress models would suggest that people that were in very, very tough times or in difficult situations, so let's say terminal illness, for example, and their carers, that they would find it almost impossible to find any helpful things to pay attention to. But she saw that these people were actually really good at it, and she created this thing called meaning-focused coping, where you change the meaning of the situation, which is almost what you're describing there. So we have a little model, one of the tools, the 3-to-1 tool you mentioned, we've got 30 plus of those tools in the book list throughout. Another one of the tools is called FAB, which stands for Fortunate, Adapt, Benefit. So it's just a little mental framework that you can use to reflect. So what was I fortunate to be able to do today? If things didn't go my way or they're not going to plan, how do I adapt the goals, reset the goals? Goals are stress management tools. If you want to increase stress, make the goal more difficult. If you want to reduce stress, make it less difficult. So how do I adapt to the goal that I had, which was maybe to get a pay rise in my peer review today? Didn't happen. Worrying about that and beating myself up isn't going to help me, so I need to reset the goal. And the final one is benefit. What are the benefits of what I've been experiencing today? So having, and certainly similar to your experience, having done my PhD in that area, I certainly think a lot differently now than I did before that, having these tools and frameworks that I've got to go back to. It doesn't mean that I don't think in a really unhelpful way sometimes. It means that I'm able to catch myself faster, and I've got tools that I can use to get my thinking back on track.
Yeah.
And that's how I envisage habit mechanics. It's, life is a journey where you're going through peaks and troughs. But when you're a habit mechanic, you've got a more sophisticated way to understand how your brain works, more sophisticated way to understand how to build better, sustainable, new helpful habits, that you'll be able to better manage your peaks and your troughs. So when you think you're on a peak, you'll be able to better assess that and work out, do I need to take a break here? Do I need to take my foot off the pedal, or can I push myself a bit further? And when you're falling down the other side, you'll catch yourself faster, so you won't fall as far, and you'll get yourself back on track faster. So it's not about being perfect. It's about getting better at managing yourself and really managing your emotions, because emotional regulation is at the heart of all this. I think that's the number one thing that if we can get good at, everything we're trying to do in our life gets a lot easier, which I go into in the book.
Yeah. Now, you had a bad experience. You were a sports psychologist, studying that. You were playing rugby. You, I guess it might be fair to say, we're not necessarily walking your talk at a moment on the rugby pitch, and it kind of spurred something in you. Do you want to tell us that story? Am I getting it right so far?
Yeah, so I was studying sports psychology at university. I was playing in essentially a selection match for an international fixture where we were going to play Australia. I was the fullback, which means that you have to catch the ball often when it's coming down from very high. The opposition kick it high up in the air, you've got to catch it. And I found myself this was a really wet, cold, windy day in the north of England. I was almost on my goal line where the opposition need to get over to score points, and the ball was coming down. Two opposition members were closing me down quickly, and all I could think of was, don't drop the ball, don't drop the ball, don't drop the ball. And I didn't even drop the ball, I just completely missed the ball. They scored a try, I got substituted. That was pretty much my rugby career over at any high level. I got quite a bad injury around that time as well. So yeah, I was kicking myself because I've been learning about, how to manage self-talk, and I wasn't doing it. But also I recognised, that the way we were being taught to manage it wasn't very effective either. It was about knowing what to do. Actually, how do we build better habits to be able to do this? Mm-hmm. So CBT is really the cornerstone, I think, of most Western sports psychology.
And that's cognitive behavioral theory?
Cognitive behavioral therapy, which is really powerful too, but again, it's never really plugged into the behavioral science to really take you to the,
right.
Okay, well, I know what to do now. I've got these tools, fantastic, but how do I get over the line and make this into a new thinking habit? Because that's what you get in academia. You get people just having theory wars with each other. They'll say, but our theory is better than your theory, and actually, no theory I've seen really explains everything about why people do what they do and how to help people to build better habits. So
yeah,
I've had to go on that journey myself and write. Not that The Habit Mechanic is a theoretical book, but it's based on really good theory, and taking lots of inspiration from everybody, and trying to put it all together in a really helpful way that allows you to do better.
Yeah, it's one of the things I like is that you're taking these theories that, are important, but aren't really giving people the results that they need, or maybe people aren't even aware of them yet, and they're still thinking in the old models that are incorrect and unhelpful, and you bring it down to earth here, and you make it accessible and give people a way to implement it versus just, oh yeah, great, theory that I have. And I do think it's interesting that you had that moment where, even though it was what you were studying, your self-talk kind of defeated you, and that started this, you decided to dedicate your life to this, and you have, and all the difference that you've made and all the things that you've done since then. It reminds me of the saying, our superpower is very often located right next to our scar.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, this is how learning happens, isn't it? So
yeah,
when you get a setback or something, and I've got a chapter in the book that maps out lots of different points in my career that were really important, but that was certainly an important point in my career. Yeah, as was, studying at a time where we were just getting access to good neuroscience research and
the fMRI stuff. The fMRI stuff is fascinating. I talk about that in my work as well. Just being able to actually see things happen, because when we make a decision, our ancient paleo mammalian brain fires first. I believe making the decision, and then nanoseconds later, our neocortex, our cerebral cortex, where we think we live, fires, and it's just agreeing with or disagreeing with, but it's not making the decision, right? And we don't feel that. We can't self-realize that, but when we look at an fMRI, we see what's happening, right?
Yeah, so we're so automatic in what we do. Professor George Lakoff would say that, so Lakoff is the white elephant guy. Don't think of a white elephant.
Yeah, which is brilliant. Elephant. Oh my gosh, that guy is brilliant. Yeah.
Yep. He would say it's at least 98% and probably more. And that's not static, sometimes it's all automatic. But at best, we've got 2%.
Right. Which, I think people have, I think that our lived experience makes people resist that on some level.
Massively. When I first heard that, I was, no way, that's nonsense. No, it can't be. So we don't want to be told that we're running on autopilot most of the time, because it's threatening to our status. We want to be, and this is, so for me, this would be my grand theory of what are we really designed to do? Well, we're designed to move around, solve problems related to survival. Mm-hmm. So really, we're designed to control our environment. And there are two core things we're interested in controlling our environment to achieve. One is we want to manage our status, because that's essential for survival. How do we look in front of other important people? And the other thing we're trying to manage is how do we feel? We want to feel good all the time, but that can be counterproductive, because we know that actually to be healthy, to be happy, it's not just about feeling good all the time. We have to suffer some pain as well, and persist through boredom and stress, because these big meaningful goals in our life that we've achieved are really important. So we've got a brain that's designed for controlling the environment. That's the way I would see it.
Well, and it reminds me of where we started, which is this whole thing of learning, which I love. Like, it's inherent in human beings. Whoever you are, wherever you are, you have an inherent superpower of learning. And now that we get to where we are, where we realize that there's a very good chance that 98% of everything we do is on autopilot. And now let's bring in something else you talk about in the book, which is the fact that all the tech companies and all the other companies as well, they are all out to, on one level or another, hijack our ability to learn for their monetary benefit, right? Like we've gotten really good at learning how to be outraged on social media, does that actually help make our lives better? No, I think arguably it makes our lives noticeably, vastly worse. But our excellent superpower of learning has been hijacked, and we have basically unconsciously on autopilot gotten really good at a bunch of things like that that are not necessarily in our best interests, right?
Yeah, so we call it the learning war. And see, I actually noticed I got a new iPhone cover,
Uh-huh.
and it opened instead of opening from left to right, it opened from right to left.
Uh-huh.
And it took me so long to get used to, open it the other way.
Right.
But I don't think we don't think of that as learning.
Right.
The iPhone's designed to make it really easy for you to learn to use it, so that you keep checking it. Because if you keep checking it, it becomes very, very valuable to you. So we don't think of these companies designing things to make it easy for us to learn them. So that they're hacking us in, they're hacking our attention.
Yeah.
And yeah, a lot of the trouble is that we have survival brains. That's the core wiring, and a lot of the habits that emerge from a survival brain, which I call survival habits, are not all that helpful in the modern world. So worrying is a survival habit because it's about worrying, what do other people think about me? Really, that's the fundamental part of worrying. But now, as you're saying, you can spend 24/7 on social media worrying about why your life isn't as good as other people. You didn't used to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
We have constant access to our emails now. We used to work predominantly in factories where you couldn't take your work home with you. So we have this ability to be constantly on. And essentially, a lot of that stuff sabotages the fundamentals of good brain function, which is good sleep, good diet, and good exercise. Yeah. So yeah, we're in a real war, and most people are not even aware of that, because why would you be? Because we're running on autopilot.
Yeah.
So that's my mission, is to help people to become habit mechanics, and first of all, help them to be more aware of their helpful habits versus their unhelpful habits, and equip them with the tools to build better habits. And the Habit Mechanic book, it's not a book with one idea repeated 10 times. It's not to sell to you so you need to buy something else. Literally everything I know is in that book. I don't have enough money to be a philanthropist, but that's it almost feels like it's just giving away everything I know. But I want to help people do better. That's my mission. So that's why I wrote the book and put everything in it.
Well, and I noticed that I think you've been very generous with that in the book, and it's a big book, but it reads really fast. It's not as it's not as actually intimidating as it looks. So you have agreed to come back to visit us again on speaklikealeader.show, maybe in early 2023. So in a few months from now. And, I'll make sure that it's a few months from when this actually goes live, because this will be a little bit before this goes live. But if you're listening and you want to join us, read The Habit Mechanic by Dr. Jon Finn. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. But if you read that and you've got questions for Dr. Finn, you can send them to me, john@johnbates.com. Send me, and just put, Habit Mechanic in the subject line, and send me any questions, anything you'd like to ask Dr. Finn, any comments that you have, anything like that, and send them to john@johnbates.com. And we will have Dr. Finn back on the show in a few months, and we will go further into some of the actual tools and some of the actual techniques and specifics. And I think that is going to be a fabulous, great learning experience. And again, I would just point out that there is a very good chance that we all have about 2% consciousness, and it just puts even more pressure on using that 2% of our consciousness to put good things in for our unconscious, right?
Yeah, so it's just people are just overwhelmed. I just opened an email before from my accountant who was trying to sell me something through, but the email was maybe 500 words. I'm not going to read that. I don't know who is going to read that.
Yeah.
And maybe I would have done a few years ago, but now I've got 30, emails coming in an hour. But so, and I know you're very focused on the micro learning and absolutely on the money, because that's all we have the capacity to do now. Because we used to live in a world where once you learned your core skills, which you did when you were in your probably teenage years. I mean, my grandparents were in the factory when they were 14 years old. Learning their fundamental skills for their work life, so early teens, early 20s, then you were set. You worked 9 to 5, you didn't take any work home with you. Now we are just inundated and bombarded. And this is why people are struggling, because our brain is not designed for the world that we live in. Our brain's number one operating rule is to save energy. So when you put it in a world where the only constant is change, when you put it in a world where there's more information than ever before, it's not going to do well. That's why everyone reports that, or more people than ever report, whether you're a child, a teenager, or an adult, report they don't feel very well because we feel overwhelmed. But there's something you can do about it. You can understand more about how your brain works in a really practical way and learn how to actually build sustainable new habits that make it easier to be healthy and happy and at your best. So there's some bad news, but there's some good news as well. The ideas in this book, this is not an experiment. These are all tried and tested. I've already had people tell me this book has changed their life. And that isn't reading it cover to cover. It's just picking out some of the tools like Jon Finn mentioned so far. So it's not about knowing, it's about doing things differently.
Well, and we talked about that as we were getting ready for this recording. To know and not to do is not to know. So how do you actually do those things you know to do? And so I think it'll be really fun to talk to you again pretty soon. And, I think that the message is fundamentally everybody else out there, every business out there, from your iPhone to Amazon to the streaming services to your grocery store, they're all trying to hack your brain for their benefit and take some of that 2% of consciousness and feed something in to just get you on autopilot for their benefit. It's really important that you do that for yourself first and foremost too. And I think that the habit mechanic is a great way to do that. So, Dr. Finn, thank you very much for joining me today. I'll look forward to talking with you again in a little while. And is there anything that you would like to say before we go? Anything that just to close us out for this one?
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. We've actually just launched what's called the Habit Mechanic University, which is a free app. And the whole purpose of that is just to post what we call the daily tea plan in there, which is the first chapter of the book. It's just a 2-minute self-reflection and planning exercise, and we post it in the Habit Mechanic community, and we support each other. And if you want to start building some better habits, that's a really low entry way to start. It's free and it only takes 2 minutes a day, and you'll start to see benefits. When I do that, it saves me at least 1 hour per day just by spending 2 minutes doing a structured self-reflection and planning. So if you're interested in getting going quickly, check out the Habit Mechanic University app, and I'll see you in there. And please do send in the questions. Yeah, it'd be great to talk about those in the next show.
That would be awesome. And will you? Can people find Habit Mechanic University at your website, tougherminds.co.uk, or?
Yeah, it's in the Apple store and it's in the Android store.
Okay, great. So just go to the Android store and search for Habit Mechanic University. And
yeah, so you can start putting your phone to some good use.
Great. Yeah, get the 2% of consciousness working for you instead of everybody else, right?
That's it, yeah.
Okay. Well, really great to have you. Very fun to talk with you about all this stuff, and I'll look forward to talking with you again. And to those of you listening, thank you so much for joining us. I really, really appreciate your time and your attention, and I hope that you enjoyed this as much as I did. And if you want to give us a 5-star rating and a review wherever you listen to your podcast, that would make a big difference for us getting out to more listeners. And if you know someone that you think would enjoy Speak Like a Leader Show, please let them know about it and recommend it to them. And thanks again for joining us. This means nothing without you. And we'll see you next time on Speak Like a Leader Show. Thanks again, Dr. Jon Finn, for joining us.
Thank you, John, and thanks to everyone for listening.
Thank you for joining the Speak Like a Leader podcast. Go be awesome.